one thing I've discovered just in this last year is that we're really blessed to have two young scientists in our club, connected with the club from this area with roots here. And the first of those is Rosemary, who last year joined our club. And then in November, she led a workshop in Harrison Park, right beside the river, sometimes in the river, gathering young little critters out of there, and I think some from a pond that she brought with her, and then putting them out for display safely, and so they're returned safely to the water, but to be viewed in a microscope and identified and see what's there. And it was a very engaging and successful event. So that is actually going to be happening again in Harrison Park. We expect October 30th, a Sunday, from 1 to 4 for the club, and from 2 to 4 for the young naturalists. So for the first hour, there would be more, maybe more scientific knowledge and maybe different vocabulary for adults. But that's something to put on your own calendar, and we'll be letting you know when that gets firmed up and get that set up with the Harrison Park people as well. So that should be great. So yeah, Rosemary is really a terrific young scientist working, doing her research here, and then sharing it with the club. And so so that's what tonight is all about. Even her winter time activities in a beaver pond in Georgian Bluffs, and going under the ice to see what's surviving and what isn't, and how they manage to do that. So and she has wonderful roots here. I know I was playing tennis this afternoon and with a fellow, and I said, "Did you know the dentist, Ron Martin?" He said, "Yeah, I ended up getting into his company. That was Tom Rice." So everybody knows Rosie through the Presque Isle and through our club now, and it's in the paper too. So so it's and also Rosie was with us for the moth night, and really had quite a presence there, getting some terrific photos and bringing her knowledge of insects to that presentation at the Gray Salvo Conservation Authority Arboretum for that summer time activity in July. And again, that is likely to be happening next year in June. And that Alan McNaughton, who led the moth night, is coming back to give us a talk on that in June as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Rosie to take it away. Thanks very much.
Okay, hello everybody. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint. Okay, hello everybody. My name is Rosie, or Rosemary Martin, and I will be sharing some stories and some things I've learned about studying overwinter aquatic insects. I'll start off with a little bit about me. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, in the lab of Shannon Macaulay, who does aquatic community ecology. And I am currently living in Big Bay in Georgian Bluffs, which has been a wonderful place to kind of ride out the pandemic and finish writing out my PhD thesis, as well as, keep my hand in doing a little bit of field work and checking out what's going on in nature. I've been a member of the Owen Sound Field Naturalists since September 2021, so just about a year ago, and thanks for the reminder to pay my dues. I need to get on that. Anyway, so today I'll be talking a little bit about what my thesis has looked at and explored, which is basically the question of how does the under ice environment affect aquatic insects that are living in the water in these northern habitats that we have around here. So there's a lot of really cool ways that insects can survive the winter. And so in terrestrial environments, insects have to deal with really wide ranges of temperatures and very extreme temperatures. So they may have to deal with really hot temperatures and really, really cold temperatures. And they have a number of strategies that they use to deal with this temperature fluctuation. They might have behavioral strategies, such as migrating south, things the monarchs. They go south for the winter, and they don't have to deal with our cold winter temperatures. Other insects burrow into the bark of trees or into the wood, or they burrow under leaf litter, where they can spend the winter hibernating or in a kind of state of stasis that's known as diapause. And so they can ride out the winter that way, or maybe they might be chewing away on the wood, like a lot of our kind of forest pests might be doing, like these mountain pine beetles. And then in addition to the behavioral strategies, there are a lot of really interesting physiological mechanisms, such as freeze tolerance. So that's when an insect can survive being frozen solid, or freeze avoidance, which is a little bit more common. And that's when they produce antifreeze compounds like glycogen or glycerol. And this allows them to go to a colder temperature before they start to freeze. And so I'm actually not going to be talking about any of the cool physiology today, but just so you know that it's out there, and there's some really cool stuff going on with terrestrial insects. Especially, I really love going out in the winter and seeing springtails, which are these tiny little insects that are actually active on the snow, and they go out on the snow and emerge and start mating very early in the spring while there's still snow around, which I think is super neat. But my real passion is aquatic insects. And the aquatic environment in the winter is a little bit different than the terrestrial environment. So whereas in the terrestrial environment, we're thinking about big temperature fluctuations and extreme cold, under ice, it's a lot more moderate and stable. And this is because water is very thermally buffered. And so once the ice forms on the top of the water underneath it stays about 4 degrees Celsius throughout the rest of the winter. And so this is actually a fairly benign environment that actually allows a surprising amount of biological activity to continue throughout the winter. However, once we have ice forming top across the water, this creates a closed system. Now, you may remember from physics lessons what closed systems are, but basically you can't get any more oxygen put into that system from the air. And what happens, biological activity in the water, from insects to fish to bacteria, they start to use up the oxygen in the water, and they deplete it to a point where it gets really low. And so low oxygen is called hypoxia, and you can even get to a state where there's no oxygen, and that is a state called anoxia. And this is really important because most animals need at least some oxygen to continue to survive and to continue their activity. And so this is one of the important environmental factors that I explore with some of my research. However, what's really important with climate change is that ice coverage is decreasing. And so on average, in North temperate ecosystems, we're seeing that ice is forming 11 days later in the fall, and it's melting out 6 days on average earlier in the springtime. And so this means that there's less chance for hypoxia and anoxia to occur. And so that can have important implications on what is going to happen to the organisms that are living in these aquatic systems that would normally experience periods of hypoxia. And so what I want to look at for my, or what I'm looking at for my thesis is what are the insects doing in the winter? Because surprisingly, we don't really know a lot about what insects do underwater in the winter. I'm not going to go too much into the methods of each particular project, but I would like to share how I study biology in the winter. So I come at it from a number of approaches. I do field surveys, and so this lets me see patterns that I can use to inform more experimental work to actually test hypotheses. I do field experiments. So this is where I can put things out in the field, but then allow natural conditions to kind of take effect. And this gives me a very realistic scenario of what is happening in the winter. But it comes at the cost of having a little bit less control over my experiments. So I can't control all of the conditions. Kind of working towards more control, I do mesocosm experiments. So these are, for example, in these artificial ponds, these are tiny man-made ponds that I'm able to manipulate the coverage of ice duration by building these greenhouses. And so here I'm able to manipulate things pretty well. But again, it comes at the cost of maybe being less like a true pond, a true natural pond would be, but a kind of nice happy medium. And then at the end of having a lot of control, but maybe not as realistic as nature, I do some lab experiments. And so this is where I'm able to do things like control the amount of oxygen that organisms are experiencing over the winter. And so this gives me a lot of control. It's really useful for answering questions, but I always like to relate it back to, okay, how does this relate to the patterns that we originally saw in the field? And so the connection between lab experiments and field observations is really important to making sure that I always stay grounded with my conclusions that I draw from the research. And then something that I do more as kind of fun, but it's also great because it keeps me asking questions about what's going on, and it keeps me excited about my research, is spying on the under ice world with cameras. And so I go out and I drill through the ice with an ice auger, and I stick basically, it's an SJ cam, which is like water, and I have a little bit of I have an oxygen meter, and so that gives me a little bit of information about what the temperature and the oxygen levels in the water are, and then I can leave the camera going for a couple of hours while I do something else, and then retrieve that footage. And so today what we're going to be doing is looking at some of the footage that I took in a beaver pond right here in Big Bay. So some of the footage is actually from the Koffler Scientific Reserve, which is closer to Newmarket, but most of the footage today is actually quite local to here. And so hopefully you will come away with a sense of what our ecosystems are doing, aquatic ecosystems are doing under the ice in the winter. So there are some challenges when it comes to under ice cinematography. First of all, it's really important to be very careful when you're going out onto the ice. So sometimes in the early fall, I want to get out there when the ice is maybe 4 centimeters rather than the safe 4 inches. So I always make sure if I'm going out onto uneven ice that I have someone or kind of thin ice, I have someone with me. I'm prepared to go through the ice, so I'm wearing my waders. And I know what the terrain is under the ice, and I never go kind of over my head, where I would be over my head if I were to break through. And so safety is really important when you're doing aquatic winter biology. Just in case anybody is inspired to go out and do it themselves, I highly encourage it, but make sure you are being safe and keep an eye on what the quality of the ice is, as well as the thickness of the ice when you're going out onto the ice. And then the other challenge with under ice cinematography is that, at least with my setup, I can't see where I'm putting my camera. So I can't focus the picture, and I can't necessarily see what I'm pointing my camera at, which means that for the most part, a lot of my videos end up looking, or at in just kind of a glow of algae for a whole 2 hours. And so what you'll see today is some nice snapshots, but it's actually the accumulation of probably hundreds of hours of footage, most of which is not very exciting. But when you do find some critters in there, it is very rewarding and definitely worth all of the work that goes into it. Okay, so we'll start off looking at some dragonflies and damselflies. And I thought I would start out with a bit of a life history recap of what dragonflies do. So you're probably familiar with dragonflies and their cousins that are smaller, damselflies, and you've probably seen them around, flying around the water. You may not be aware that they actually spend most of their life under the water as in this kind of larval stage, or what they're technically called are naiads. And so they spend most of their life in the water growing and eating things, and then they finally emerge, crawl out of the water, and then become this beautiful winged adult form that we are most familiar with. And so this is what the larval stage of a damselfly looks like. And this is what the larval stage of dragonflies look like. There's kind of two main forms. One is short and stubby. So these are the cordulids and libelulids. And then these long kind of alien looking fellows are echinids, or maybe gomphids. And just so you know what you're looking for when we watch the video. So we're going through the ice here, and pause it. Nope. Okay, well, up there, that was a Canada darner. I didn't manage to pause it in time. So now we're under the ice, and we're looking at some moss, which is surprisingly green, as well as some, I think it's reed canary grass probably. And so this is actually a flooded landscape that then was kind of dry in the summer, but has since been flooded in the fall. And so now this becomes the overwintering landscape for these aquatic insects. And so if you look over here, you'll see this tiny little kind of gray-brown creature, and this is a dragonfly larva, which is probably a libellulid or a cordulid going across. Now we'll get a better view of a different larvae, but again, it's probably a libellulid or a cordulid. And I absolutely love these guys. I think they look like kind of little alien teddy bears. You can see their little 2 eyes. And it's quite amazing how well camouflaged they are with the background. So hopefully you can make it out. I forgot to speed up this one. Some of the videos on here are sped up a little bit because while life does continue under the ice, it happens a little bit slower. Okay, so he's moving again. You can see I think it has, oh, here we go. You can see hopefully that there are some wing pads on the back of this dragonfly larva, which means that it's probably a species that will be emerging in the early spring, because it's got the developed wings already ready to go, which means it's kind of a later stage dragonfly larva. But you can see it's crawling. It crawls across the aquatic landscape through the winter, and it's probably going around looking for food, which is kind of crazy because you think, when you think of winter, you don't really think about these food webs continuing. So now we're going to look at an Eschnid larva, which will be coming up right here. So this long fellow that kind of glides by, and it's using kind of a jet propulsion mechanism that its rear end that it uses to kind of project it through the water. And so there was one that came up here, and it's here now. And in a moment, we should be able to see it again. Oh, here we go. Here it's kind of gliding, shooting back into the distance in the water. And so here is a damselfly, and so these are kind of the skinnier ones. They have, they've got gills that, so dragonflies have internal gills, damselflies have external gills. So they have these three kind of paddle-like appendages at the base of their abdomen. I actually forget where the damselfly is in this one, but you can see there's also a lot of zooplankton swimming around, which is, you know, it's something that the damselflies and dragonflies would absolutely love to eat. So there is actually quite a bit of food in the winter available for these aquatic insects. Maybe we'll skip forward a bit. Oh, here's another damselfly. They kind of swim with these kind of wavy motions. Ooh. And I don't know what's going on here. It did not like me skipping. Okay. Yeah, so they kind of have this kind of S-shaped swim pattern. And a lot of what I do when I am looking at these videos is I'm actually looking for motions, and that is what helps me. Oh, and we have another one swimming into frame here with that kind of S shaking swimming pattern. But the way that they swim really helps me identify what they are, because sometimes this isn't very good, but you can still tell what you're looking at just based on how it moves. And again, you can see there's a lot of zooplankton in this habitat. This zooplankton rich one is actually at my research station outside of Newmarket. Okay. Okay, so research highlight. So in my thesis, I was really interested in whether or not winter kill could occur in dragonflies. And so winter kill is what happens when an organism is really sensitive to low oxygen conditions, and so it maybe has high oxygen requirements. And so if hypoxia occurs in the winter, then you might experience there might be big die-offs of a certain species. And so this is most commonly known in the fish, where if you have a period of hypoxia, you could have just massive die-offs of fish in your lakes. And this is actually just a naturally occurring phenomenon. And it goes into structuring what different fish species we find in kind of cold and northern environments, because it selects for fish that have maybe lower oxygen demands. But we don't really know whether or not this occurs in aquatic insects or in dragonflies. And to set out to answer this question, I did a field survey where I looked for patterns of overwinter decline in different dragonfly species. And I found that indeed there were five or so species of dragonflies that showed overwinter declines, including the common green darner, which we actually saw in our videos that we just looked at. And so we can see these patterns, but is it actually caused by hypoxia? We don't know. So what I did was a lab experiment where I tested the relative hypoxia tolerance of different dragonfly species, including the common green darner. And what I discovered is that while some of the species were fairly tolerant of low oxygen, even some of the ones that were showing declines, indicating that their decline is probably due to something else like fish predation maybe, or maybe they're emerging. Common green darners are particularly sensitive to low oxygen, which means that winter hypoxia likely contributes to the overwintering decline pattern that we see in our field surveys. And why this is important is because the common green darners are voracious predators. They eat a lot of other insects, including other dragonflies, and they're even known to eat small fish and amphibian larvae. So you can see here, this kind of big alien dragonfly is eating small little fish. And what does that mean in the context of climate change? Well, you may remember that with decreasing ice coverage, we are probably also seeing a decrease in hypoxia, which was currently acting as an environmental filter, restricting the number of these big dragonflies that can survive the winter in our spring communities. So if we have less ice coverage and less hypoxia, we're going to have more surviving green darners in our aquatic communities in the spring, which is really great for the common green darner, but it's not so great for the species that they eat, which is pretty much anything that is smaller than them. So it will be interesting to see whether or not we see shifts in communities based on the removal of this environmental filter, which is hypoxia. So I talked about dragonflies overwintering the larval stage. There are a couple of exceptions to that. A couple of dragonflies overwinter in the egg stage, and a couple of damselflies do this as well. And so this is a dragonfly, and these are damselfly eggs, spotted spread-wing damselfly eggs that are laid and inserted into grass stems where they overwinter. Now, meadowhawks that overwinter, so they overwinter in the egg stage, and they do something really strange. They have this strange behavior where they tap their eggs and release them not only into the aquatic environment, like most dragonflies do, but they also lay eggs on land. And so they split their eggs between the terrestrial and aquatic environments. And this is a really curious behavior. And so one of my chapters was try to investigate, why do we see this clutch splitting behavior? And so I did a number of both field and laboratory experiments. And what I found, the research question is, why do meadowhawks lay eggs both on the land as well as in the water where they're going to overwinter? And the answer is risk spreading. So there are different risks in the terrestrial and the aquatic environment for the eggs that are going to overwinter. At first, I thought maybe freezing might be a risk, but I found by performing some experiments but they can actually super cool to minus 26 degrees Celsius before they freeze inside, which is pretty cold hardy. However, if you're a dragonfly egg that's laid on land, then you're really relying on flooding in the springtime to reach up to the point where you are laid. Otherwise, you're going to be dry in the springtime and you're not going to hatch. So the biggest risk probably with being laid in the terrestrial environment is that you might not be able to hatch if there's not enough rain in the springtime. However, you might ask them, why not just lay all your eggs in the aquatic environment? Well, the answer to this is probably the activity of detritivores, so things that eat decomposing organic matter, like snails and caddisflies. They're active in the water during the winter. And what I found through some laboratory experiments is that they actually love to eat dragonfly eggs. And so eggs that are overwintering underwater are going to be at risk of being preyed upon by these other aquatic invertebrates. And so here you can see an egg that's being broken open by a hungry caddisfly. And then this is an egg that was found in some snail poop. Although it's really interesting actually is that this egg actually still hatched despite going through the digestive tract of the snail. So that leads me to caddisflies. So caddisflies are related kind of most closely to moths and butterflies, although they're in a different group. Instead of having scales on their wings like moths and butterflies, they have tiny little hairs on their wings, and they have these beautiful long antennae. And like moths and butterflies, they have a kind of caterpillar-like juvenile stage. But what's really cool about caddisflies is that they live in aquatic environments and they build really beautiful houses out of the materials that they find around them in their environment. So caddisflies that are in the spring or in streams and rivers will build little homes out of rocks that help weigh them down. But caddisflies that are in ponds and lakes generally build cases out of things like pine needles and bits of leaf, and they make these really beautiful structures. And a lot of caddisflies are actually active through the winter. And so we're gonna take a look at what the caddisflies are doing under the ice. And so this is one of the species that I used when I was looking at whether or not dragonfly eggs are at risk. And so you can see them, the video is spread up, but you can see them trundling and exploring the environment. These grasses probably contain a lot of delicious damselfly eggs, which would definitely make a good meal for these caddisflies. So you can imagine if you're a dragonfly egg in the aquatic environment, you kind of hope that there aren't too many caddisflies around you, or you might become a snack. So these ones make, this species makes these beautiful patchwork tubes. This one kind of makes more of a thatched cottage type case. And you can see it kind of, what I think was really cool about caddisflies is that they use the top of the ice over here, and they use that as a kind of a extra surface that they use to walk along the top of, or the underside of the ice. Here we have another beautiful tube one, although this is a different species, and so their tubes are a little bit different looking. They've got more bands of the same type of leaf rather than a patchwork quilt. But you can see again, so this is in the beaver pond. You can see this beaver stick here. And you can see that there is, even though it's February 1st, there's quite a lot of activity going on in the water. So now I'm going to move on to another one of my favorite aquatic insects, which are the back swimmers. So back swimmers are predators. They're true bugs with piercing, sucking mouth parts that they use to pierce into their prey and then suck out the goo. They love to eat mosquito larvae. And so this is actually a back swimmer that's feeding on a mosquito larva. And what's interesting about back swimmers is that what we didn't know before, but we now know, is that they feed at 4 degrees. So this one is actually chowing down on mosquito larvae at 4 degrees Celsius. So back swimmers all overwinter as adults, and these adults have wings that they can use to fly, but they only fly when they're trying to move between habitats. So they spend most of their time swimming around under the water, kind of on their backs. Something I think is really cool, that's not really my research, but I think is really fascinating, is how back swimmers breathe underwater. So back swimmers, unlike dragonflies, don't breathe dissolved oxygen. What they do is that they capture bubbles from the surface that they then drag down, kind of like a scuba tank. So they breathe and use up that bubble. And the way that they hold on to these bubbles is by having tiny, fine hairs on their wings and other body parts that kind of trap that air against their body. So what's I think is a really interesting question is, how are these aquatic insects that are relying on bubbles of air staying active throughout the course of the winter when they're cut off from access to the air by the ice? So we know that they can hold on to the bubbles for about 120 days. However, this experiment where they found that was actually done on taxidermy specimens, which means that they weren't actually using up the oxygen. So physically, the bubble can stay there for 120 days, but it's probably not going to last that long if the organism is actually consuming the oxygen in that bubble. And so what may be happening is, once the bubble gets really, it becomes just a very thin layer of air against the body. And at this point, what is called plastron breathing is possible, where dissolved oxygen in the water is actually able to diffuse into the very thin air bubble, which basically means that the bubble becomes a bit like an artificial lung. However, we don't really know if all species of back swimmer are doing this, and they're not, as good at plastron breathing as some other aquatic insects are. Also, I don't know if we know how effective plastrons are if we are experiencing low oxygen conditions, low dissolved oxygen conditions, so in these hypoxic or anoxic environments. So I think this is a question that is open and still needs to be addressed and is really exciting. Unfortunately, I did not get to that in my thesis, but I think it's worth kind of sharing and putting out there some really cool questions. So here let's see. Let's see some back swimmers swimming under the water. So they're kind of teardrop shaped, and they use their really long hind legs to propel them through the water. And because they have these air bubbles, they're actually kind of quite buoyant. And so it's a bit of a struggle for them to actually go down and stay in the water. They kind of have to cling to things if they want to stay a little bit deeper. What I also think is interesting when you look at these videos is that swimming through cold water seems like it's a bit of a struggle, which makes sense when you think about the viscosity of cold water. Cold water is a lot thicker to swim through, and so remaining active through the winter is going to have some additional energetic costs because it's just going to be that much harder for these small insects to kind of swim through this, almost gel-like water compared to what the viscosity of water is when it's warmer. So one of the things I was interested in looking at is how does winter length affect the survival, dispersal, and reproduction of aquatic insects. In this case, I was looking at back swimmers. And so I did an experiment where I had some back swimmers that had kind of they went straight into cold winter conditions, and some back swimmers had kind of an extended warm fall where they were able to, they were at 10 degrees for a little bit longer than the other group, and they were able to swim around and eat, although both of them were fed as much as they could eat during the whole course of the experiment. So some things that I found from my research is that there is a cost to overwintering. So I found a difference in survival. So in the individuals that had a kind of a longer winter period, a lot of the males died. And so females did okay, but we found fairly high male mortality in the kind of a long winter group. However, if we have kind of a short winter with that warm fall period, we saw much higher male survival to the point where male and female survival ratios were about equal, which has interesting consequences for climate change, because if we have kind of warmer fall periods, then we're going to see potentially more males surviving through the winter and being available to mate in the springtime. I also wanted to look at dispersal ability as well as reproduction. And what I found was that females were able to disperse sooner. So they were able to kind of fly and leave bad habitats sooner when they had a warm fall period, so that shorter winter. And they also started to lay eggs sooner than females that were overwintering or had a kind of longer winter. And so we're seeing that if we have a warm fall period, females are able to start flying and start laying eggs pretty much as soon as it warms up. For females that don't have a warm fall period, what we see is that the females spend a little bit more time feeding and recouping kind of the energy stores, the fat stores that they've used up in the winter before they start to do things like disperse or reproduce. So yeah, it's likely due to higher fat stores that they were able to put on in that warm fall period. And so what this could lead is to an advance in spring phenology. Phenology is the timing of life history events such as reproduction or migration. So you might think of things you might think of like flowering time or arrival at nesting grounds. A lot of studies that look at the climate change for phenologies look at things like flowers, flowering times, if environments are warmer and the flowers are out but the insects don't respond to the same cues. You might have flowers that are not being pollinated because their pollinators are not available. And we also, if you're a big bird fan, then you might know about sometimes birds have phenological changes responding to warmer temperatures and warmer climates. And so sometimes they arrive at their breeding grounds and there's maybe not enough food available for them because their food is not responding to the same cues that they are responding. And so what we end up with is something called phenological mismatch, which can be quite disruptive to ecosystems. So what I think is really neat about my study is that most studies looking at phenology focus on the consequences of having warm springs. But with my research, what really drives home is the fact that not only warm springs, but warm falls can lead to advances in things like dispersal and reproductive phenologies. And so we could see combined impacts of warm springs and warm falls kind of leading to a synergistic effect on organisms. So really, not only spring is important to study, but also fall conditions as well that lead into an organism overwintering. Okay, next we're going to some water boatmen. Water boatmen are related to the backswimmers, and they look pretty similar, although they're a little bit more oval shaped. And unlike backswimmers that are predators, water boatmen are, this is a little bit sped up. Water boatmen are herbivores and detritivores. So they're eating things like algae and bacteria and decomposing organic matter. And like backswimmers, they're also bubble breathers. So it's, again, interesting to see. I'm not sure how they're getting their oxygen through the winter, and it's a really intriguing question. Something that's interesting is leeches stay active through the winter, so it might be a bit hard to see, but this right here is a leech. So leeches, they're not insects, but they're invertebrates, so I'm going to count it. But leeches remain active through the winter. I don't think there's a lot of research on what leeches are doing in the winter, so I think there's lots of room to explore there. Zooplankton, so these are, I'm not actually sure because I've been told by some zooplankton people that they're Daphnia, and some people think that they're copepods. Whatever they are, they're tiny freshwater crustaceans, and they look like snow, but in some overwintering environments, they're just super abundant in the winter. And we actually know that zooplankton communities change from spring, from summer to winter. So we actually have completely different species being dominant depending on the season. So there's some really cool research that's going on in the zooplankton world that I kind of like to relate to some of the work that I do with macroinvertebrates. And then I thought I would close with a bonus vertebrate, because I know everybody likes things with spines, even though I love my insects. So this is a surprise visit from an eastern red-spotted newt that I see. I see eastern red-spotted newts occasionally show up on film, and sometimes I also see some tadpoles swimming around under the ice as well. And sometimes actually, once I caught a muskrat on video too. That was exciting. I haven't caught a beaver, which I would love to find a beaver, but not yet. So hopefully through this presentation, I've convinced you that winter is an ecologically exciting period, which is definitely underexplored in scientific literature. But that just means there's a lot of questions that I get to ask and go out in the field and explore. But I think some of the lessons that we take home from the research that I've done for my PhD thesis is that ice coverage and hypoxia are going to be really important determinants of survival and winter activity for aquatic invertebrates. And so it's really important to know how these things affect different species of aquatic insects, so that we know how the changes are going to affect both those insects and the rest of the aquatic food web that relies on those insects as food. With that, I'd like to thank my supervisor, Shannon McCauley, and the rest of her wonderful lab, as well as you can't do it alone. I've had a lot of help from undergraduate assistants and advice from committee members. The Koffler Scientific Reserve, which is the field station that belongs to U of T, that's outside of Newmarket, has been very helpful in me being able to do my experiments. And I'd also like to thank my parents, Peter Martin and Camilla Geary, who have been invaluable in coming out with me and making sure that I'm safe on the ice, as well as occasionally babysitting my insects and catching earwigs and flies to feed to my back swimmers and other helpful things like that. And then I also have a number of granting or funding sources that have helped keep me employed through the span of my PhD tenure. So if you are intrigued by insects after this talk and you want to see some aquatic insects up close, there are a couple of upcoming opportunities that I will be involved with. So Critters in the Creek is actually something that's put on by my supervisor, Shannon McCauley, and it will be happening in the Alton, in Alton, which is near Orangeville, so a little bit south of here. I don't know, I know everybody lives kind of spread out. So if you're close to Orangeville and you want to check it out, it's going to be put on by the Alton Grange Association. So you can check out altongrange.ca, and we will be checking out some aquatic insects in the Grange Creek. And that will be happening on Saturday, September 17th from 11:30 to 2. And then the other thing that will be happening is, as John Dixon mentioned, I will be putting on an aquatic insect identification workshop on Sunday, October 30th. For the older crowd, if you're interested in knowing some of the kind of scientific terms and doing some more in-depth identification, I will be starting at 1, and then starting at 2 will be a little bit of hands-on exploring and just looking at things through the microscope, which might be a little bit more kid-friendly. So feel free to show up at either time, or come and go as you need, but you're all welcome to join me. And yeah, that's about it for me, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have them. Okay. There's a question from Brendan, which is the data that is used to conclude that ice forms 11 days later and melts 6 days earlier. So I think that is, and I should know this, I think that's, so originally from a paper that was published in 2000. So it's actually a little bit of older research, although it's being kind of corroborated by some more recent ice modeling data. And I think it's based on a number of decades worth of ice data from northern hemisphere lakes. And so these are kind of averages that we're seeing and not necessarily like what we're going to see in every case, but these are the general trends. And in fact, current models are projecting that we're going to see an even more drastic decrease. So we're already seeing these decreases of 11 and 6 days, but we'll probably see even shorter ice coverage duration as climate change progresses.
Thanks. That's what I was afraid you were going to say.
Yeah. Okay, I have a question from David Morris. What is the effect of a midwinter insect survival and phenology? So that is a great question. So if you were a terrestrial insect, you're probably most definitely going to be experiencing a midwinter or kind of thaws, like freeze thaw events. And this can be disastrous for insects that are not adapted to it. So terrestrial insects that are adapted to cold climates often are able to tolerate, but it can definitely be a problem for organisms that kind of go into a hibernation state and then get woken up, and then it's cold again and they have to freeze again. So one example is wood frogs. So wood frogs freeze solid. They overwinter in the terrestrial environment. And so if we have kind of snap warming and then freezing in the winter, this can really be really bad for wood frogs because they kind of thaw out and then they get frozen and they're not ready to get frozen again. If you're in the aquatic environment, which is buffered, then I think, so this is something that I would love to explore, is the effect of moat formation. So when we get warm up events in the winter, in aquatic environments, what happens is you get this melted edge of the lake or the pond, and then that is going to allow not only contact with the air, but also you get an influx of meltwater, bringing more oxygenated water into the aquatic environment. So that might actually replenish oxygen supplies for the aquatic invertebrates. So I think my prediction would be that with kind of melting, with kind of freeze thaw events in the winter in aquatic environments, we're going to see more activity of aquatic invertebrates. Okay, one of the questions is populations of dragonflies and damselflies are much lower this year than in the past. Do I know why? I think that could be a number of reasons. I know that in general there is a decline of insects in general, often related to things like insecticide use, as well as changes in habitats. So something that might be important for dragonflies is drought. So if the dragonfly species live in kind of more only semi-permanent habitats, kind of things that are habitats that are prone to drying, which is great because they're less likely to have fish predators in there. But then, if they dry out and your larvae die, then you're going to have fewer dragonflies. So I don't actually know in particular what might be causing that a decline in dragonflies this year, but things like drought are really important for dragonfly communities. The question is eutrophication a factor in any of the ponds that I'm working in? Yeah, so eutrophication can lead to hypoxia. So you probably have heard of hypoxia in terms of things like crimson tide in the oceans. Eutrophication in the ocean can lead to algal blooms that then die and then get consumed by bacteria and environments that then kill everything. So so that probably plays a factor into whether or not ponds become hypoxic in the winter in the first place. Another thing is that, so in some of the clips you saw a lot of tiny zooplankton dancing around. In the beaver pond up here, I think it's probably less eutrophic, so it has less nutrients. And I think you see I see a different zooplankton community, so not as many of those little daphnia or copepods dancing around, and I see a lot more actually phantom midge larvae. Okay, next question is Jim. So I showed the very effective camouflage of damselfly nymphs and dragonfly nymphs under the ice. Who are they wanting to hide from? So that's a great question. They're probably trying to hide from fish, although in the beaver pond up here, we don't actually have any fish, but they're also probably hiding from each other. So dragonflies are a bit notorious for being fairly cannibalistic. So they'll eat other species of dragonflies. They'll eat the same species of dragonflies. And so basically, when you're in an aquatic food web, if you're a predator, you can eat anything that's any of the animals that are smaller than you. Is kind of a size-based food chain. Okay, next question is, even with an earlier ice melt, these dragonflies and damselflies continue to remain in the water for some time. So is this also time related growth and evolution timeline that's affected? Yeah, so I think we will see eventually advanced emergence times as kind of water bodies continue to warm and we get earlier thaws in spring. We're going to see dragonflies starting to emerge earlier. And we actually see this across a latitudinal gradient. So this, for a lot of dragonfly species, they have populations in the south, but then also in the north. And in southern populations, some dragonflies, you know, they might have multiple generations in a year. And then in northern populations, you're more likely to only get one generation in a year. And that's kind of slowed by the amount of growth that they're able to achieve during the winter. And actually in very northern populations of some dragonflies, they actually spend multiple years in the water before they're big enough to emerge from the aquatic environment into the terrestrial environment. Okay, next question is, how much of a dragonfly's growth or development occurs over the winter? So probably for dragonflies, not the majority of it. So most of the dragonfly's growth or development is going to occur either in the spring or the summer or the fall, with kind of, even though they're feeding during the winter, they're probably not going through too many developmental stages, just because it is their metabolisms are a lot slower and there's less food available. But I think something that's really interesting is that they do continue to feed, and the continuance of feeding might be really important to maintaining body fat stores, so that when they can remain active through the winter and avoid things that might eat them if they were, you know, to fall asleep through the winter. So they stay active and avoid things, but they need to feed to maybe maintain those energetic costs of remaining active, so that when they get to the springtime, they're not all skinny and, you know, they're a little bit more ready to go if they keep eating through the winter, and they don't starve. And then comment more than a question. Intrigued that back swimmers' hairs can hold bubbles for 120 days. And RBCs last 120 days. I'm not sure what RBC is.
Red blood cells.
Oh, okay, interesting. Very cool. I wonder if there's any structural relationship to that. The back swimmer study was actually done as a more of an engineering project. So they were kind of looking into these insects as potential for maybe designing more sleek ship hulls by having tiny little hairs or something like that, because that bubble actually makes them more hydrodynamic. Are there aquatic insects that go dormant in the winter? So I think the answer is yes, but so I know some other species of back swimmers. I don't see, so we're looking at the grouse-wing back swimmer. I haven't seen a lot of the other species of back swimmer in my underwater videos. We don't necessarily know a whole lot about other back swimmer species that are overwintering, but I think some of them do kind of have more of a dormant stage in the winter. And I think that's really interesting that there are, you know, differences between different species, even of the same kind of organism, in terms of what food webs are looking like in the winter versus the summer. But I would say for the most part, whenever I start looking at an aquatic organism that, say, my friends and colleagues are studying in the summer, and then I look for in the winter, sure enough, I can find it active under the ice, kind of doing its thing. Okay, I think that might be it for the questions. So if that's it, I will say thank you to everyone for coming and listening to my talk. Hopefully I've imparted some of my love for aquatic insects and winter ecology to you, and I hope to see you at future Owen Sound Field Naturalist events, as well as maybe the workshop in October.
And thank you very much, Rosemary. Sorry, my video won't come back on, but
I can stop sharing maybe.
oh. Yeah, it still says unable to start video, but again, I think participants are leaving us, but I want to thank you very much for a delightful talk. And yeah, you've given me several things to think about and pursue. I'm not sure, I thought John was going to come on, but I'll give the final thanks then, and just thank members also for participating. And I'll just urge you, while we have weather like this, but even when it gets cold, where Rosemary seems to thrive, get out there and make the most of it. So good night to everyone.
Take care.